December 7th, 1941. The Pacific sky above Oahu burns red and black as rising suns shimmer off the wings of Japanese aircraft. The thunder of bombs splits Pearl Harbor wide open, sending fire across the decks of battleships moored helplessly in the bay. In those hours of chaos, Japan's admirals believe they have crippled the United States beyond recovery. They think they have time to expand, time to fortify, time to make the Pacific an impregnable empire of the rising sun. Yet time itself would become their most elusive enemy. For even as oil fires raged across Pearl Harbor's waters, an industrial machine larger, faster and more relentless than anything the Japanese imagined had already been set into motion. The Japanese naval officers standing in the wreckage of battleships could not yet know it. But across the continental United States, assembly lines, steel mills, and shipyards were preparing to unleash a tempo of construction so furious that it would shatter centuries-old doctrines of naval warfare. 6 months later, June 4th, 1942, the Northern Pacific, near a small windswept atoll named Midway. The ocean is calm, but beneath its serene surface lies a trap. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, steam proudly into battle, their decks stacked with aircraft, their crews veterans of Pearl Harbor. Confidence hangs in the salt air. Their intelligence reports suggest an easy ambush, another victory. But as the sun climbs, American dive bombers plunge from the sky, their bombs slamming into Japanese decks, igniting fuel lines, detonating munitions. In less than 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers burn from bow to stern. The 4th follows soon after. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, receives word that his proud fleet has been cut to pieces. What shocks him most is not merely the defeat, it is how quickly the Americans had replaced what was thought lost. Just months after Pearl Harbor, the United States had more carriers at sea than Japan could believe possible. Smoke and fire cloud the Pacific horizon. Survivors aboard Japanese destroyers gaze in disbelief as American carriers seem to multiply like phantoms. Where had they come from? How had the Americans conjured these floating fortresses in such a short time? The Imperial Navy had assumed, based on Japan's own pace of shipbuilding, that the United States could not field replacements for years. But Japan's calculations, rooted in traditional naval construction, underestimated the Industrial Revolution that had been weaponized in America's shipyards. At Newport News, at Brooklyn Navy Yard, at the sprawling Kaiser Yards on the West Coast, the sound of steel rang day and night, sparks showered like artificial stars, as welders stitched together the skeletons of ships at speeds unheard of. Traditional riveted construction gave way to modern welding, slicing months, sometimes years, from timetables. Entire sections of carriers were built in parallel and then hoisted into place like puzzle pieces. Where Japan would take years to commission a fleet carrier like Shokaku or Zuikaku, the United States birthed Essex-class giants in a fraction of the time. The Japanese intelligence officers, poring over intercepted reports, struggled to reconcile the numbers. American yards were completing carriers in months, sometimes less than a year, a pace that defied naval precedent. On the open ocean, the effect was surreal. By late 1942, Japan's striking arm, the Kido Butai, the proud carrier fleet that had stunned the world, was diminished, gasping for breath. Yet on the horizon, new American carriers appeared as though conjured from mist. Each one bristled with aircraft, bristled with firepower, bristled with a speed of construction that Japan could neither match nor comprehend. To Japanese sailors, it felt as though every carrier sunk only summoned another too. Their commanders began whispering in disbelief. The United States was not fighting with ships. It was fighting with factories. The Pacific theater became not just a battlefield of steel and fire, but a test of time itself. Japan's admirals had trained to fight decisive battles, to smash an enemy in one crushing blow. But what they had not prepared for was an enemy whose strength grew faster with each passing month. As battles raged in the Solomon Islands, at Guadalcanal and in the Coral Sea, American carriers kept arriving. Their names etched into history: Yorktown, Enterprise, Hornet, Essex, Bunker Hill. Each was a floating city of steel, completed not in decades but in months, powered by the relentless hum of American industry. To the Japanese, the sight was demoralizing. Survivors of Midway told of their disbelief. How could the Americans lose a carrier one month and sail out with another the next? Their own shipyards in Kuri and Yokosuka labored painfully over every hull, craftsmen hammering rivets by hand, designs revised and delayed, resources stretched thin. A single Japanese carrier required years of labor, and each one represented a treasure of materials and manpower. America, by contrast, treated carriers as if they were commodities, built quickly, launched quickly, and if necessary, sacrificed quickly. In Tokyo, naval planners examined the data with mounting dread. The numbers were stark. By 1943, the United States was commissioning new Essex-class carriers at a rate of one every few months. Each displaced 27,000 tons, carried more than 90 aircraft, and sailed at over 33 knots. Japan had no equivalent pace, no way to match this industrial avalanche. What had once been an ocean of Japanese advantage was becoming a sea of American steel. Out on the waves, the men felt this imbalance in their bones. Japanese pilots took to the skies, knowing that even if they struck down one enemy carrier, two more would rise to take its place. American sailors, fueled by the knowledge of an endless supply chain behind them, fought with a confidence that bordered on inevitability. The ocean itself seemed to tilt in their favor, not because their ships were indestructible, but because their nation could conjure more from the furnaces of Detroit, the cranes of Brooklyn, the welding torches of Richmond. The battle scenes became increasingly one-sided, flames consuming Japanese decks contrasted with fresh American hulls sliding into the sea back home. Every explosion in the Pacific was answered with the ringing of steel in American factories. Time, once Japan's assumed ally, had betrayed them. The very months they believed they had gained at Pearl Harbor were instead transformed into the forges that birthed a fleet unlike any the world had seen. By 1944, as Japan's empire strained under the weight of attrition, the Americans unleashed wave after wave of new carriers, their decks brimming with planes that blotted out the sun. In every Japanese report, the refrain echoed the same haunting disbelief. The Americans are building ships faster than we can sink them. For the rising sun, it was not the loss of men, nor even the loss of islands, but the loss of time itself that marked the beginning of the end. By the spring of 1942, the Pacific was no longer a tranquil expanse guarded by the rising sun. It had become a vast chessboard, and every piece was in motion. Japan had seized Singapore, Hong Kong, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies with lightning speed. Its armies marched with confidence, its navy sailed with arrogance, and its empire stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Tokyo believed the war would be decided quickly, before the United States could muster a response. For decades, Japanese strategists had studied the teachings of Alfred Thayer Mahan and envisioned a climactic naval battle where the fate of nations would be determined in one decisive clash. Pearl Harbor, Midway, Coral Sea, these were supposed to be stepping stones toward that inevitable showdown, but the Americans refused to play by those rules. Washington did not see the Pacific as a stage for one duel. It saw it as a war of endurance, fought not only with ships and men but with factories, railroads, and resources. Even as Japanese commanders basked in early victories, the gears of America's war machine were beginning to turn at a pace that would defy comprehension. The strategy was simple in theory, but daunting in execution. Overwhelm the enemy not with brilliance alone, but with numbers so staggering that no defeat could slow the advance. Japan, for all its audacity, was shackled by geography and industry. The home islands lacked steel, aluminum, and oil. Every gallon of fuel and every sheet of armor plate had to be seized, stolen, or shipped across waters that grew more dangerous with each passing month. Their shipyards were centers of craftsmanship, where skilled workers painstakingly riveted each plate of armor, each seam of steel, building carriers as though constructing temples of war. A Japanese carrier, like the Shokaku or Zuikaku, might take years to emerge from the slipways, each one a jewel of naval architecture. But war is not kind to jewels. It is a furnace that consumes them without mercy. The United States, by contrast, was blessed with abundance. It had oil fields in Texas, coal in Appalachia, iron in Minnesota, and shipyards stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. American engineers looked at the challenge not as artisans, but as industrialists. They asked, how do we build faster, cheaper, and in greater numbers? The answer lay in assembly line thinking, in the lessons of Detroit's automobile plants, in the genius of men like Henry J. Kaiser, who transformed shipbuilding into an act of mass production. Japanese officers knew they could no longer dictate the tempo. They were reacting, scrambling, always behind. Strategically, this meant that American operations gained momentum like a rising tide. Each campaign built upon the last, Gilbert's, Marshall's, Mariana's, Philippines, each supported by fresh carriers that guaranteed overwhelming air power. The Japanese, denied time to recover, found themselves compressed into ever-shrinking territory. The industrial advantage had become a strategic vice, squeezing tighter with every battle. By the end of 1944, the Imperial Navy was broken. The once proud carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor lay at the bottom of the sea. Survivors sailed under constant fear, knowing their replacements were not coming. America had not only built faster, it had broken the will of its enemy. The psychological war was won before the final bombs fell, before the rising sun was eclipsed. For the Japanese, the realization was bitter. They had gambled on time and lost to an enemy who could manufacture when the war finally staggered toward its brutal conclusion in 1945. The lessons of the carrier race were etched in steel and in blood. The Japanese Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, was shattered beyond repair. Its proud carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, lay rusting beneath the waves, monuments to an empire that had gambled on speed and surprise. The Americans, by contrast, sailed into the final year of the war with more carriers than the rest of the world combined. From the Essex-class giants to the swarming escort carriers, their decks stretched across the horizon like floating cities, each one bristling with planes, each one a reminder that the United States had turned industry into a weapon of mass dominance. In Tokyo, the High Command knew the truth long before the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Reports of new American carriers commissioning monthly arrived like hammer blows. By the end of 1944, American shipyards had produced more tonnage than the entire Japanese fleet had ever possessed. Even if Japan had found a way to win tactical victories, the strategic tide could not be reversed. Time itself had betrayed them. The very months they thought they had, stolen at Pearl Harbor, had become the furnace in which their defeat was forged. The legacy of this industrial triumph extended far beyond World War II. Admirals and generals across the globe studied the lesson. Modern war would not be decided by individual brilliance or by the craftsmanship of a few master shipwrights. It would be decided by logistics, by production, by the ability to replace faster than the enemy could destroy. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, reflecting on Germany's own defeat, confessed, "We built better tanks, but you built tanks that worked together." The same was true at sea. Japan had built exquisite carriers, but America had built carriers that arrived in endless waves, coordinated, reinforced, and supported by a nation mobilized to its core. This philosophy shaped the Cold War that followed. In Korea and Vietnam, American carriers projected power across continents, their lessons drawn directly from the Pacific War. During the Gulf War in 1991, it was again carriers, descendants of the Essex class, that launched wave after wave of aircraft, proving that mobility and speed of deployment mattered more than sheer firepower alone. The concept of network-centric warfare, born in the crackle of FM radios and the hum of assembly lines in the 1940s, became the backbone of 21st century strategy. Connection outweighed armor. Coordination outweighed brute strength. For veterans, the legacy was personal. Sailors who had served on those carriers remembered not only the battles but the sense of inevitability that came from knowing reinforcements would always arrive. Their memories carried pride but also sorrow, for they understood what it meant for the enemy. Japanese sailors had fought bravely, often with suicidal determination. But bravery could not conjure steel. No amount of spirit could summon replacements from empty shipyards. For the families of American servicemen, the endless tide of carriers had meant hope, the assurance that their sons fought with the full weight of a nation behind them. The Essex class itself became immortal. Some served for decades, modernized and refitted, their decks witnessing the transition from propeller-driven aircraft to jet fighters. They carried the United States into the Cold War, into the nuclear age, into conflicts on distant shores. They became symbols not just of victory, but of endurance, proving that what America had built in desperation also had longevity. Japan, meanwhile, was forced to rebuild from ashes, its future navy born not of empire but of defense, its ambitions tempered by the memory of an enemy that could outbuild and outlast. The final, sobering truth of the Pacific War was this: Japan never lost for lack of courage or tactical brilliance. It lost because it could not keep pace with time. The United States turned factories into forges of war, and each weld, each rivet, each crane swinging steel into place was as decisive as any torpedo strike. The Americans did not simply fight battles, they manufactured victory, and so, when the rising sun finally set over the shattered empire in August 1945, it was not extinguished solely by atomic fire or by invading armies. It was extinguished by something more inexorable: the unstoppable rhythm of industry, the ability to build faster than the enemy could destroy. In that rhythm lay the future of warfare. The lesson endures. In modern conflicts, nations understand that technology alone is not enough. A single tank, a single plane, a single ship means little if it cannot be replaced. What matters is the network, the supply chain, the relentless capacity to endure losses and continue forward. The United States proved this in World War II with its carriers, and the world has never forgotten. From the burning decks of Pearl Harbor to the steel slipways of Brooklyn, from the shattered hulls at Midway to the triumphant fleets at Leyte Gulf, the story was always the same. Japan built ships, America built time. And in modern war, time is the deadliest weapon of all. Yet the true destruction came not merely in the sky, but beneath the waves. Submarines stalked Taiho and Shokaku, firing torpedoes that sent them to the bottom. Japan had lost two of its finest carriers. In past wars, such a loss would have broken a navy for years. But here was the cruel arithmetic. America lost no fleet carriers that day, and even if it had, fresh Essex hulls were already sliding into the Pacific. The tempo was irreversible. For every Japanese carrier that sank, America had another on the way. Consider Guadalcanal 2 years earlier. The bitter struggle for Henderson Field saw Japanese and American carriers trading blows in rapid succession. The Japanese fleet, operating at the end of long supply lines, struggled to replace each lost carrier. America, though battered, repaired damaged ships with breathtaking speed. Yorktown, written off as crippled after Coral Sea, had been patched in just 72 hours to fight at Midway. Hornet, damaged beyond repair, was soon replaced by fresh Essex hulls steaming from the west coast. To the Japanese, it seemed as though the Americans fought with endless decks. In battle after battle, this industrial rhythm turned the tide. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, Japan committed nearly everything it had left. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, all surged into the Philippines to deliver a decisive blow. Yet their decoy carriers, stripped of most aircraft, were little more than targets. Opposite them sailed a storm of American steel, Essex-class carriers bristling with planes, light carriers escorting invasion forces, escort carriers supporting amphibious landings. Even when Admiral Kurita's force threatened American transports, small jeep carriers and destroyer escorts fought with suicidal courage, buying time until heavier reinforcements arrived. The Americans could afford to gamble, to risk ships, to sacrifice, because behind every hull lost, another was waiting in the slipways. German observers watching from afar, analyzing reports from their Japanese allies, could not believe the numbers. They were accustomed to long production cycles, to careful craftsmanship. The idea that an enemy could replace entire fleets within a year defied the logic of naval warfare. For centuries, navies had measured their power in ships that took years, even decades, to build. Now America was measuring in months. The Japanese sailors who lived through these battles felt the despair most keenly. Survivors of Midway described watching the horizon fill with new carriers, each one fresh, each one brimming with aircraft. Pilots trained at great cost and time were being lost faster than they could be replaced, while American air groups seemed endless. It was as though the Americans fought not with men, but with an inexhaustible tide of machines. At Aracourt on land, the Germans faced the same lesson. The Panthers were superb tanks, but they were few and every loss cut deep. The Americans fought with Shermans that were technically inferior, but they had radios, coordination, and replacements streaming across the Atlantic. On land and sea alike, the pattern was unmistakable. America had weaponized mass production, and it was a weapon more decisive than any bomb or torpedo. The battles told the story in fire and steel, but beneath them was a deeper truth. Japan had sought to control the Pacific through speed and surprise, striking before America could mobilize. But once the United States engaged its industrial furnace, surprise no longer mattered. Even defeat could be turned into strength, because the Americans could rebuild faster than the Japanese could recover. Every carrier lost became a lesson learned. Every setback answered with 2 more ships. The oceans bore witness to this transformation. From Midway to the Marianas, from Guadalcanal to Leyte, Japanese sailors fought valiantly, but they were trapped in a war of attrition they could not win. For every ship that sank beneath the waves, the tide of replacements rolled inexorably forward. The Pacific, once a domain of Japanese dominance, had become a conveyor belt of American steel. By 1945, the lesson was carved into the waves themselves. The Japanese fleet, once the most feared in the world, was reduced to hulks and memories. The Americans sailed into Okinawa and Iwo Jima with more carriers than Japan had ever possessed, their decks crowded with planes, their hulls fresh from the shipyards. Survivors of the Kido Butai, once proud, could only watch as the rising sun was eclipsed by the industrial dawn of the United States. The carriers kept coming. By 1944, the Pacific no longer felt like an ocean to Japanese sailors. It felt like a trap closing in from all sides. Every horizon revealed new decks, fresh squadrons, and the relentless hum of American engines. The battles were no longer contests of maneuver or surprise. They were avalanches of steel and fire, pressed forward by an enemy that seemed immune to exhaustion. The psychological toll was as destructive as any torpedo. For the Japanese Navy, every carrier was a treasure, every pilot a rare gem. The Imperial Navy had trained its aviators with the intensity of samurai, honing them into elites who carried both skill and spirit. Losing one meant not just the death of a man, but the loss of years of irreplaceable experience. By contrast, the Americans treated aircrew as part of a vast cycle. If one squadron fell, another took its place. If a carrier burned, another sailed in from the west coast. That rhythm eroded Japanese morale. They were not just fighting ships. They were fighting a nation's heartbeat. The strategic impact was enormous. At Midway, the loss of 4 Japanese carriers crippled Tokyo's ability to project power. But the Americans, having lost Yorktown, replaced her within months. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the United States could field 15 carriers, fleet and light, against just 9 Japanese, many of which were understrength. The skies were flooded with Hellcats and Avengers, coordinated through radar networks and FM radios that kept formations intact even in chaos. The Japanese, unable to replace their downed aircraft or trained pilots, saw their offensive strength collapse. The war was not simply fought in guns and torpedoes. It was fought in the minds of men. Japanese sailors watched as their fleet shrank, their comrades lost, their skies emptied. Every report of a new Essex-class carrier commissioning drove home the inevitability of defeat. American commanders exploited this psychological dominance. They knew that even if one battle went badly, reinforcements would tilt the scales again. Strategy became aggressive, confident, unyielding. Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Halsey could commit forces boldly, knowing the shipyard stood behind them like an inexhaustible arsenal. To the Americans on the decks, this advantage felt tangible. They boarded new ships smelling of fresh paint, their decks gleaming, their hangars humming with modern equipment. They knew replacements were coming, that their nation would not abandon them to fight with scraps. That knowledge was a shield stronger than armor. Veterans wrote of the comfort it gave. Even in the darkest hours, they trusted reinforcements were already steaming across the Pacific. The Japanese felt the opposite. Every loss was permanent, every defeat a wound that never healed. Their shipyards could not keep pace. Their resources dwindled, their training pipelines collapsed. Young pilots were rushed through truncated programs, barely prepared to take off, let alone challenge seasoned American aviators. The once feared Kido Butai became a shadow of itself, its carriers sent to sea with token air groups, its commanders forced to gamble lives in hopeless attacks. This imbalance reshaped the Pacific campaigns. At Guadalcanal, Japan fought tooth and nail for months, pouring ships and men into a battle that drained its reserves. America, though bloodied, could replace every loss. By the Marianas Campaign, the pattern was irreversible. Japanese admirals entered battle already burdened by a sense of doom. Their fleets lacked the mass to win. Their men lacked the confidence to endure. The psychology of abundance versus scarcity colored every encounter. Japanese sailors described the terror of American air raids launched from multiple carriers, the sky black with planes. They wondered how the enemy could still field so many, even after months of attrition. Rumors spread that American shipyards were enchanted, that their industrial power bordered on sorcery. In truth, it was no magic, just welding torches, cranes, and the discipline of millions of workers back home. On the home front, America turned its industrial might into a shared national purpose. Newspapers printed photographs of new carriers sliding down slipways, headlines celebrating the pace of construction. Civilians cheered, understanding that each launch was a step closer to victory. For families with sons at sea, these ships were lifelines, promises that their loved ones would not be abandoned. Every hammer strike echoed across the Pacific, strengthening the resolve of those already in harm's way. Japan could not replicate this. Bombers struck its industrial base, choking production. Fuel shortages forced ships to remain in port. Even if new carriers were completed, they sailed without sufficient aircraft or fuel to be effective. The Empire's war machine sputtered, even as America's roared louder with each passing month. The psychological effect was devastating. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the secret advantage could no longer be hidden. Japanese commanders knew they were falling behind, yet they could not alter the fundamentals of their economy. Their shipyards remained slow, their resources dwindled, and their factories strained under Allied bombing campaigns. The Americans, meanwhile, had only begun to reach full stride. It was this contrast, the artisan against the assembly line, that defined the hidden truth of the Pacific War. Japan had waged a war of daring, hoping to secure quick victories before America's industrial giant could awaken. But that giant was not only awake, it was running. And its footsteps shook the earth. September 7, 1942. The Richmond shipyards in California glow like a second sun against the night sky. Thousands of welders, riveters, and laborers work under blinding arcs of blue light, sparks raining down like fireworks. The roar of machinery drowns out the Pacific surf as cranes swing massive steel sections through the air. What once took years of painstaking craftsmanship is now being assembled with mechanical precision in mere months. This was America's hidden battlefield, the industrial front. Here, carriers were not born as singular marvels of design, but as products of mass engineering, stamped from the same blueprint, multiplied with relentless efficiency. The Essex-class carrier was the embodiment of this philosophy, displacing 2,700-ton standard, stretching 872 feet in length. It was not just a ship, it was a moving fortress. Its armored flight deck carried more than 90 aircraft, Hellcats, Avengers, Dauntless dive bombers. Its engines produced 150,000 shaft horsepower, propelling it at speeds over 33 knots. Yet the true marvel was not its size or firepower, but the way it was built. Unlike Japan's Shokaku class, which required over 2 years to complete, an Essex could be launched in barely 14 months. Some were ready for combat in under a year. The secret lay in modular construction and welding. Each ship was broken into hundreds of prefabricated sections, built simultaneously in separate yards, then welded together like pieces of an immense puzzle. Welding itself was a revolution. Traditional riveted construction consumed manpower and slowed progress, but welding saved thousands of hours and allowed lighter, stronger joints. Where Japanese shipyards clung to rivets, America's workers, many of them women who had never set foot in a factory before the war, mastered the torch. Rosie the riveter became Rosie the welder, and the tempo of production accelerated beyond anything the Axis could fathom. Factories like Newport News and Brooklyn Navy Yard embraced the philosophy of scale. Each yard became a symphony of synchronized labor, with thousands of workers operating as one organism. The Essex hulls were standardized, their blueprints distributed to multiple facilities across the nation. No longer was naval construction the province of a few specialized yards. Now the United States could build carriers simultaneously in multiple locations, each one following the same industrial script. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States built 24 Essex-class carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and more than 100 escort carriers. Japan, in that same period, managed to produce only a handful of fleet carriers, each one arriving too late to alter the tide of war. By the time Japan launched Taiho in 1944, the Americans had already flooded the Pacific with Essex hulls, each bristling with aircraft and supported by destroyers, cruisers, and battleships also churned out by the assembly line miracle. Beyond construction speed, American design reflected a pragmatism that baffled Japanese naval architects. The Essex class was not meant to be a perfect ship, it was meant to be a reliable one. Its machinery was simple enough to be maintained at sea, its layout allowed rapid repairs, and its open hangars meant faster sortie rates for aircraft. Japan's carriers, by contrast, were masterpieces of efficiency and striking power, but fragile when damaged. Their enclosed hangars and limited armor turned every hit into a catastrophe. At Midway, a single bomb found its way into Japanese hangars and ignited entire squadrons of aircraft. On an Essex, damage control crews backed by better pumps, fire suppression, and compartmentalization could often save the ship. Behind these technical marvels stood the supply chain. Factories in Detroit that once built automobiles now produced aircraft engines by the thousands. The great steel mills of Pittsburgh poured armor plate day and night. Electronics companies like Motorola and RCA supplied radar sets that gave American carriers an invisible eye over the horizon. Even the Chrysler plant, famous for its cars, shifted to producing Wright Cyclone engines, the beating hearts of carrier aircraft. America's war machine was not a collection of industries. It was a single organism, pulsing in unison toward victory. The pace was staggering. In 1943 alone, the United States launched 65,000 tons of new aircraft carriers, compared to Japan's 17,000. For every Japanese pilot preparing to take off from a carrier deck, there were 3 Americans ready to launch from multiple ships. For every Japanese mechanic laboring over a Zero fighter, there were teams of Americans assembling Hellcats faster than the enemy could shoot them down. War, once measured in battles, was now measured in tonnage, in output, in production schedules. To Japanese intelligence officers, the reports seemed surreal. They tracked American construction and sent warnings back to Tokyo. Yet the numbers were so large that many dismissed them as exaggerations, propaganda designed to frighten. Only when squadrons of Hellcats swarmed over islands, when carrier after carrier appeared on the horizon, did the reality sink in. America had turned industry into a weapon, and the Essex was its blade. The technical edge extended into the smaller escort carriers as well. Known as jeep carriers, these ships were built on merchant hulls and could be produced in record time. They lacked the speed and punch of the fleet carriers, but they multiplied American presence across the Pacific. They ferried aircraft, supported invasions, and hunted submarines. Each one represented the philosophy that quantity, when combined with competence, could overwhelm quality. Even in the realm of aircraft, the Essex carriers multiplied advantage. The F-6F Hellcat, designed specifically to counter the Zero, rolled off production lines by the tens of thousands. Each Essex could carry entire squadrons, ensuring numerical superiority in every engagement. Japan's A6M-0, a marvel in 1941, was by 1943 outmatched, not just technologically but logistically. America could replace every lost Hellcat in days. Japan struggled for months to replenish even a fraction of its losses. Every rivet, every weld, every section hoisted by crane carried strategic weight. When the first Essex carriers steamed into combat in 1943, they were more than ships. They were the embodiment of industrial momentum. For Japanese sailors, watching fresh carriers arrive after every battle was like staring into the depths of an ocean that never ran dry. For American sailors, boarding a newly launched carrier was a promise. No matter how fierce the fight, they were backed by a nation that could build faster than the enemy could destroy. It was not simply that the United States built carriers. It was how it built them, standardized, modular, industrial, relentless. Japan's naval planners had expected years of breathing space after Pearl Harbor. Instead, they found themselves gasping for air, drowning in a tide of steel and fire that grew heavier with each passing month. September 13th, 1944. The rolling hills near the French village of Aracourt are draped in a grey morning mist. Dew clings to the wheat stalks, and the ground trembles with the distant rumble of engines. German Panthers prowl the fog, their silhouettes looming like predators stalking prey. For once, the battlefield seems tilted in their favour. Thick armour, long-barreled 75mm guns, crews hardened on the Eastern Front. Yet as the Panthers advance, they are met not with static defences, but with a ghostly dance of opponents that appear and vanish like phantoms. The Americans are here, fighting with something the Germans cannot comprehend. Not simply tanks or aircraft, but coordination so seamless it feels supernatural. Radios crackle across miles, voices guiding units as though they were extensions of a single hand. In the fog, the Germans lose cohesion. They do not realize that what shreds their assault is not just steel. It is the American mastery of time and replacement, embodied most fiercely on the sea. The war in Europe mirrored the struggle in the Pacific, but nowhere was the industrial advantage more vivid than in the carrier battles across the vast ocean. The Japanese had staked everything on decisive engagements. They struck boldly at Pearl Harbor. They maneuvered with precision at Coral Sea. They gambled everything at Midway. Yet each clash, even when tactically brilliant, bled their carriers dry. The Americans, meanwhile, absorbed blows and returned with more ships than before. Take the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19, 1944. It would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 300 Japanese aircraft rose from carriers like Taiho, Shokaku and Zuikaku, desperate to halt the American advance. But across the horizon, an armada of Essex-class carriers unleashed wave after wave of Hellcats. Radar-directed, coordinated through flawless radio communication, the Americans shot down Japanese planes by the hundreds. The once feared Zero, symbol of Japanese dominance, fell burning into the sea. By nightfall, the Japanese carrier air arm, painstakingly trained over years, was shattered. This clash of doctrines, the artisan versus the assembly line, the masterpiece versus the machine, was the real battle unfolding beneath the waves. Japanese admirals trusted in the quality of their ships and the skill of their sailors. American planners trusted in the relentless rhythm of industry. Both sides gambled that their doctrine would carry the day. By 1942, the contrast was stark. Japan's naval arsenal centered around its 10 fleet carriers, many of them veterans of Pearl Harbor. Each was precious, irreplaceable, the pride of its empire. The loss of even one was a wound that took years to heal. America, however, was already laying down the keels of the Essex class, a new generation of carriers that could be produced in parallel across multiple shipyards. They were designed with modular construction in mind, prefabricated sections built separately, then welded together in record time. For every Japanese ship launched, the Americans aimed to launch 3. This industrial duel soon echoed across the battlefield. When the Yorktown was mauled at Coral Sea and limped into Pearl Harbor with holes ripped through her decks, American crews swarmed over her like ants. In just 3 days, she was patched, refitted, and sent steaming toward Midway. Japanese officers were stunned to learn that the same carrier they believed destroyed was fighting again so soon. To them, such speed bordered on the impossible. Yet for the Americans, it was only a glimpse of what was to come. The broader war situation grew more desperate for Tokyo. Germany's Eastern Front demanded ever greater resources, drawing Axis attention away from the Pacific. The submarine campaign in the Atlantic tied down Allied shipping, but it also brought American shipbuilding into full swing. Liberty ships, tankers, destroyer escorts, vessels of every kind poured into the sea at an unprecedented rate. By 1943, American shipyards were launching new hulls faster than German U-boats could sink them. This tide of steel freed the United States to focus its might on the Pacific. For Japanese soldiers dug into jungle outposts, the impact was visceral. They would fight bravely, hold an island, repel one assault, only to see the Americans return weeks later with more men, more planes, and above all, more ships. Each wave was larger than the last, and the carriers seemed endless. Even when a Hornet or Lexington was lost, another appeared, steaming into the war zone with decks crowded with aircraft, its crews fresh and ready. The psychological contrast between the two nations deepened with every clash. Japanese crews understood that their carriers were singular treasures. To lose one was to cripple the fleet. American crews knew that even if their ship fell, others would carry on. That knowledge hardened resolve on one side and eroded confidence on the other. The year 1942 marked the turning of the tide, not only because of Midway, but because of the realization that Japan could not keep pace with the tempo of American production. The rising sun had reached its zenith, casting its light across half the Pacific. But the horizon was darkening with storm clouds of steel and fire, forged not in Tokyo's shipyards, but in America's vast heartland. Japan had built an empire in months, but the United States was preparing to erase it in years, not decades. Every ton of steel rolling out of Pittsburgh, every rivet driven in Richmond, every hull launched in Brooklyn was a countdown to Japan's reckoning. The empire's gamble at Pearl Harbor had bought only a fleeting advantage, one that melted away as soon as America's industrial furnace was stoked. By the close of 1942, whispers circulated through the Japanese high command. The Americans were not merely replacing ships, they were multiplying them. The numbers no longer made sense. How could an enemy that was supposed to be crippled already outpace them? Admirals who had once spoken of glory now spoke in hushed tones of inevitability. For the first time, Japan sensed that it had awakened not a sleeping giant, but a tireless one, fueled by a machine that could not be stopped. In the dimly lit war rooms of Tokyo, maps stretched across tables like fragile spiderwebs, lines of ink tracing an empire that had surged outward in every direction. Admirals leaned over them with furrowed brows, their confidence shaken by Midway's devastation. Reports trickled in. Yorktown sunk, yes, but new American carriers were already sighted. Enterprise still roamed the seas. Hornet remained active. And then came whispers of others, carriers the Japanese had not anticipated, steaming into battle far sooner than their intelligence predicted. Something was wrong. The Americans were not obeying the logic of naval warfare as the Japanese understood it. Their ships appeared faster than they could be accounted for, as if conjured out of thin air. The mystery confounded Japanese analysts. After Midway, they estimated it would take the United States years to recover from the loss of carriers. But within months, new hulls prowled the Pacific. The secret advantage, invisible to Japanese eyes, lay not on the battlefield, but in the foundries and factories of America. While Japan built carriers like artisans sculpting statues, the United States built them like automobiles, through mass production. The doctrine of modular construction, pioneered in shipyards from Newport News to the West Coast, was the unseen weapon that would break the back of the Imperial Navy. The Americans did not need perfection. They needed speed. They needed numbers. They needed ships in the water faster than Japan could sink them. At places like the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, innovation redefined the art of war. Instead of laying a keel and painstakingly building upward for years, American yards broke carriers into vast prefabricated sections. These steel modules, already wired, welded, and equipped, were hoisted by giant cranes and locked together like blocks. A process that had taken the Japanese 3 to 5 years was now being done in a fraction of the time. This doctrine extended beyond carriers. The Liberty ships, humble cargo vessels, symbolized the power of industrial mass production. Built in an average of 42 days, some were completed in less than 3 weeks. Their example carried into larger projects. If a freighter could be assembled like a machine off an assembly line, why not an aircraft carrier? American engineers embraced the challenge, welding rather than riveting, building in parallel rather than sequentially. For the first time in naval history, ships were not masterpieces, they were products. Japan struggled to grasp this transformation. Its shipyards remained rooted in traditions of craftsmanship. At Kure Naval Arsenal, workers hammered rivets by hand, aligning steel plates with meticulous care. Every ship was a singular creation, demanding resources and labor in quantities Japan could scarcely afford. Oil shortages strained production, steel was rationed, and skilled craftsmen were irreplaceable. In contrast, America harnessed unskilled labor. Men and women pulled from farms and cities, trained in weeks to operate welding torches and cranes. Factories hummed 24 hours a day, powered by an endless supply of electricity, coal, and optimism. The secret advantage was not simply speed of construction, it was the confidence that flowed from it. Japanese sailors fought knowing that the loss of a single carrier meant a wound that could bleed for years. Americans fought knowing that their fleet could absorb losses and keep moving forward. This invisible shield, the assurance of replacement, was as deadly as any torpedo. By 1943, this hidden advantage was becoming clear. Reports reached Tokyo that the Essex-class carriers were entering service at a pace that defied belief. Displacing 27,000 tons, carrying more than 90 aircraft, they represented a new breed of carrier, faster, tougher, and far more numerous than anything Japan could deploy. Admirals read the intelligence with growing disbelief. If the Americans could field these giants in numbers, Japan's cherished Kido Butai would be outmatched not by skill, but by sheer abundance. At sea, the effect was devastating. When the Japanese fleet encountered American forces, it seemed as though carriers multiplied overnight. One sunk at Coral Sea, 2 more arrived at Guadalcanal. Another burned at Midway, yet replacements sailed into the Solomon Islands within months. Japanese pilots whispered that their enemy had an endless ocean of steel behind them. The sense of inevitability began to gnaw at morale. The Americans, meanwhile, understood the psychology of their advantage. Every time a new carrier launched, it was more than a ship, it was a message. A message that America could not be broken, that its factories could turn tragedy into strength. Workers in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Richmond may never have seen the Pacific, but their labor was carried there in every welded seam, every engine block, every deck plate. To the men fighting aboard these carriers, the roar of their engines was not just the sound of machinery, it was the echo of millions of hands across the continent, lifting them forward. The Japanese had their own brilliance. Their Zero fighters danced through the skies with elegance. Their naval doctrine emphasized aggressive strikes, coordinated assaults, and the mastery of surprise. But even the sharpest blade dulls when used against an anvil. The Americans had become that anvil, an industrial juggernaut that could absorb blow after blow and emerge stronger with each strike.